Assalamualaikum students, this video is for question 4 part B, November 2023 exam series. It's paper 22, 9708 A-level economics. And as you are aware that there are 8 marks for assessment objective 1 and assessment objective 2. Assessment objective 1 is knowledge understanding, assessment objective 2 is analysis, and there are 8 marks for these two objectives. And for assessment objective 3, that is evaluation, there are another 4 marks. So there are 12 marks, that's how they are divided. This question is about macroeconomic performance. So whenever there is a question about macroeconomic performance, remember to talk about these 4 important indicators. GDP/economic growth. Do talk about real GDP and economic growth. That is one indicator. That is very important macroeconomic indicator. Another one is employment or unemployment. The third one is inflation. And my tip would be that whenever you speak about inflation, do talk about demand pull and cost push inflation separately. And the fourth indicator you need to talk about is current account or trade deficit. You need to be aware of the difference between current account and trade deficit. Trade deficit records the export and imports of goods only, and it is one of the 4 sections of current account. However, current account is not our today's topic. So we will look at the question one, and before we begin to discuss its possible answer. Assess whether a rise or a fall in terms of trade will benefit the macroeconomic performance of an open economy that is heavily dependent on international trade. To get top marks, one must answer this question in the context of an open economy that heavily depends on international trade. Without using this context, the candidate will miss the opportunity of scoring top marks. So we first talk about what is terms of trade. We do not need to give definition formula, but just for the convenience, for a good start, we may give the formula of terms of trade. It is export price index. It is a numerical measure. Export price index divided by import price index into 100. So, and you may also give a brief description. It's a numerical measure that compares the prices of exports and imports. So, first we discuss the impacts of increase in TOT. What causes an increase in TOT is not the scope of this question. Usually there are 2 reasons, but we do not need to talk about them over here. However, for your understanding, let me tell you that the 2 major factors that can cause a change in terms of trade are exchange rate and rate of inflation. In a country where inflation rate is comparatively higher than that of inflation rate of other countries, TOT of that country is likely to go up. Similarly, a country with a stronger currency, a country whose currency appreciates, is also going to experience a rise in terms of trade as appreciation or a stronger currency makes exports relatively expensive. Now, since we have talked about that, we will be first talking about the impact of increase in TOT. So we say TOT rises when export prices rise faster than import prices. Exports become relatively expensive and imports look cheaper. Now, this is a brief description of increase in TOT. TOT rises when export prices rise faster. So the impacts. And so what we do, we write over here, rise in TOT, and we can start giving a summary of what happens when TOT rises. It's price of exports, price of imports, quantity of exports, quantity of imports, net exports, aggregate demand, real GDP, employment, demand pull inflation, and cost push inflation. Now we look at these things one by one. Now if TOT rises, price of exports look higher. I'll just use the arrows. Imports price look cheaper. Quantity of exports falls. Quantity of imports rises. Now, assuming PD is more than 1, PD for net exports, is more than 1, what will happen? If price rises, there will be a relatively greater proportionate change or fall in quantity of export, and that would mean that the next export, the revenue of net exports would fall. Now, students who are doing A-level, composite A-level, they are aware of Marshall-Lerner condition. So they may mention that. However, AS students need not to refer to Marshall-Lerner condition. They can only give a reference to price elasticity of demand. So price of exports is higher, quantity would fall. What will be the impact on export revenue? It depends upon PED. If PED is high, as we are assuming here, net exports would fall. Since net exports are a component of AD, please do write that AD will fall as well. When AD falls, it shifts to the left. We'll make a diagram. It shifts to the left, and that causes a decrease in real GDP. And when we have lesser real GDP, when we have lesser output, we'll hire few workers to make the output. So employment would fall as well. A downward shift, a leftward shift in AD, however, will help control demand pull inflation. So demand pull inflation will fall. Cost push inflation, since imports are relatively cheaper, we will be able to import raw materials at lower cost, so we will be able to produce goods at a lower cost of production. So cost push inflation may also fall. So what we need to do, we need to make the diagrams. So we make diagram 1 for this, diagram 2 for this, and diagram 3 for this. So first we draw diagram 1. Now AD shifts to the left, its real GDP, its price level, exports seem expensive, imports seem cheaper, people switch from relatively expensive exports to cheaper local goods. That causes a leftward shift in AD. Real income falls from Y1 to Y2, and price level falls from P1 to P2. So diagram 1 and 2 could be like this diagram can tell us that because of a higher TOT, real GDP will fall and demand pull inflation will also fall. Employment will also fall because to make lesser output, we need lesser workers. So what we are going to do, that we talk about the cost inflation now. The diagram 3, imported raw materials would look cheaper, cost of production will fall, initial AD, initial AS, initial income, initial price level, do label diagrams. AS will shift to the right, cost push inflation will also be less. So what we can do, we can give the summary, a higher TOT means local goods are less price competitive. People switch from local goods to imports. Exports rise, imports fall. Net exports fall, and since net exports are a part of AD, AD falls. This decreases real GDP and less workers would be hired to make smaller output. Unemployment will rise. However, a decrease in AD may help control demand pull inflation. Cost push inflation may also fall due to cheaper imports and lower cost of production for businesses relying on imported goods. And over here, you can give the context that since this is an open economy, relying heavily on international trade, the decrease in cost of production could be quite significant. So that's how we will write. I have given you the summary in the table. All macroeconomic indicators are given except current account. We'll talk about that later. So we can also do the same thing for fall in TOT. Price of export will look cheaper. Price of import would look higher. Quantity of export would rise. Quantity of imports would fall. Net exports would rise if PD for net exports is more than 1. And since net exports are a component AD, AD would rise. That will raise real GDP and economic growth. And to make greater output, more workers would be hired, employment would rise, demand pull inflation would rise, and since imports would be relatively expensive now, imported goods become expensive, cost of production goes up, and cost push inflation will go up. So what we have done, we have not only explained the effects, macroeconomic effects on different indicators, we have actually shown both positive and negative effects. While increase in TOT is helping reduce inflation, the positive side is that inflation will be controlled, but the negative side of higher TOT, the real GDP will fall. Whereas a fall in TOT helps control economic growth, helps raise economic growth, but it triggers inflation. So there is a positive side and there is a negative side. So we now move on to discuss the evaluation. Whether a rise or a fall is more beneficial depends on two things. Number one, price elastic demand for net exports. If PD for net exports is low and a country like Saudi exporting a necessity product like oil, increase in TOT is beneficial. However, if PD for net exports is high, a fall in TOT is better. And we can actually talk about the fourth macroeconomic indicator over here. We can talk about it earlier as well, and that is current account. Current account, या balance of trade will improve if PD for net exports is more than 1 and TOT falls. Otherwise, current account will worsen. The second thing on which the effect depends on is the current status of economy. As we know, the increase in TOT lowers AD, where the fall in TOT raises AD. So it depends on the availability of excess capacity. So if excess capacity is available, and inflation is low, a fall in TOT will help raise AD and employment. So a fall in TOT is better if excess capacity is available. However, for economies experiencing inflation, operating above full employment, those economies which are operating above full employment, however, economies experiencing inflation, operating above full employment, a rise in TOT is better, as this controls inflation. So this concludes my discussion on this question. I hope you enjoyed this video and it turned out to be beneficial for you. Please keep us updated with your feedback and do subscribe our channel. Thank you very much.